Welcome to Native American history, where every timestamp is a cut on the map. Today we open the map and trace the still warm footsteps. January 1838, New Echota, Georgia. A sovereign nation with a written constitution, elected council, and its own newspaper faces the execution of a federal policy set 8 years earlier. Gold strikes near Dahlonega cotton expansion across North Georgia and the Indian Removal Act of 1830 converge on Cherokee homelands along the Hiwassee and Etowah. Two documents frame the crisis before the first wagon moves. Worcester of Georgia in 1832 recognizes Cherokee self-government in principle. The Treaty of New Echota, negotiated in 1835 and ratified in 1836, cedes the East in practice. The gap between law on paper and power on the ground is now the battlefield. Principal Chief John Ross petitions in Washington City. Georgia state officials press surveys and lotteries. United States Army officers wait on orders. Mission records list dwindling attendance as families weigh what to carry and what to leave. At Fort Cass, Tennessee, quartermasters mark out depots and stockade posts. Across farmsteads, headmen warn that a deadline for voluntary departure will yield to forced columns. The actors are clear. The Cherokee Nation, with its council at New Echota, and detachments soon to form on the road. The state of Georgia seeking jurisdiction and land. The federal government balancing statute, court ruling, and treaty while preparing wagons, rations, and guards. The country is not yet at war, but the tools of war orders, timetables, and logistics are being applied to civilians. The question is precise. By what sequence of orders, escorts, ferries, and ration schedules did removal proceed from Georgia and Tennessee through Kentucky, Illinois, and Missouri to Indian Territory in 1838 and 1839? A second question follows. Why did that sequence produce such high mortality, despite planning that named every depot and river crossing? This episode establishes the map that dates the offices and the people who made the march possible, then traces how those decisions reshaped a nation that rebuilt itself west of the Mississippi. April 1830, Washington City. Congress passes the Indian Removal Act and authorizes treaties exchanging eastern homelands for lands west of the Mississippi. The law establishes funding, contracting authority, and executive discretion, 1824 to 1838. The Bureau of Indian Affairs operates under the War Department and manages annuities, agency rules, and removal logistics. The administrative center of gravity is military, not judicial, 1802 to 1829. The Georgia Compact promises the federal government will extinguish native title in Georgia when possible. Gold is discovered near Dahlonega in 1829, and land speculation accelerates. Cotton prices and the spread of the cotton gin drive planter demand for river bottoms from the Etowah to the Cowoosa. New Echota. The Cherokee Nation adopts a written constitution and strengthens central institutions. 1828. The Cherokee Phoenix begins publication and expands literate political debate. 1828 to 1832. Georgia enacts laws extending state jurisdiction into Cherokee territory, nullifying tribal courts, and criminalizing Cherokee governance. The Georgia Guard arrests resistors and pressures families to sell improvements. 1832. Worcester of Georgia recognizes tribal sovereignty in principle. The decision is not enforced. State surveys and lotteries proceed. 1835. The Treaty of New Echota is negotiated by a minority delegation. 1836. The United States Senate ratifies the treaty by a narrow margin and sets a 2-year window for voluntary migration. 1837. Appropriations fund roundup transport and subsistence. Agents let contracts for wagons, flatboats, and rations. Land and resource pressures intensify across the decade. The Western and Atlantic Railroad is chartered in 1836 and surveys cut across Cherokee farms. County sheriffs and speculators map parcels for auction. Timber water rights and ferries along the Hiwassee and Tennessee gain value. The policy logic is consistent. Remove title barriers. Open land to cotton. Feed the rail grid. Convert river crossings to tolls under state control. Immediate administrative shifts follow ratification. Federal agents standardize roles, issue metal tags in some districts, and order disarmament around stockades. Mission schools face new license requirements from state authorities and report falling attendance as patrols increase. Agency ration rules tighten. Corn and salt issued for voluntary emigrants are cut or delayed to limit dependency and to push departures. Winter 1837 to spring 1838. Arrests rise as the deadline approaches. Families hide livestock, bury valuables, and send petitions to Washington City. Principal Chief John Ross leads a campaign to void the treaty. The campaign slows decisions but does not stop preparations. Objectives, constraints, and logistics, snapshot by side. Cherokee Nation. Objective: preserve homeland and legal personality of the nation. Secondary objective: if removal is unavoidable, control timing and internal order to protect vulnerable people. Constraints: state laws override tribal courts. Federal refusal to enforce Worcester. Minority treaty used as binding instrument. Limited cash. Exposure to Georgia Guard raids. Seasonal disease risk in camps. Logistics: high literacy and strong council networks. Access to mission wagons and blacksmiths. Limited powder and firearms under disarmament. Food reserves uneven after repeated seizures. Ability to form detachments under Cherokee conductors if authorized. Strategy: in early 1838, continue petitioning. Stall mass movement until cooler months. Negotiate to replace contractor-led batches with Cherokee-led wagon trains. Pre-position tools for road repairs. State of Georgia. Objective: bring Cherokee territories under full state jurisdiction and transfer land to settlers. Constraints: need federal treaty cover. Risk of federal-state conflict if enforcement is challenged. Cost of policing remote valleys. Public controversy over treatment. Logistics: Georgia Guard detachments, county sheriffs and militia. Court schedules for auctions and lotteries. Ferries and bridges under local control. Close ties with speculators. Methods: arrests for trespass or new state offenses. Seizure and auction of improvements. Pressure on missions. Enforcement of licensing on traders and ferries. United States federal government. Objective: execute the Treaty of New Echota and avoid open war. Deliver parties to Indian Territory. Contain costs and disease. Constraints: divided public opinion. Contested treaty legitimacy. Limited rivercraft and winter-ready wagons. Variable contractor quality. Budget ceilings. Logistics: War Department oversight. Bureau of Indian Affairs agents. Quartermasters at Fort Cass, Tennessee, with sub-depots at Ross Landing and Gunter's Landing. Estimated several thousand troops and militia available for roundup. Contracts for bacon flour, salt coffee, and soap by pounds per person per day. Flatboats and steam connections on the Tennessee and Mississippi, subject to season and ice. Orders in spring 1838 instruct Major General Winfield Scott to assemble stockades, register families, and move initial groups by water before heat and disease peak. Triggers that move the plan from paper to road are cumulative. Notices of the May 1838 deadline expire. Army circulars authorize seizure of households who have not departed. Disarmament removes hunting rifles and reduces access to game. Ration cuts and irregular delivery in temporary camps increase vulnerability to measles and dysentery. Early contractor movements in summer 1838 report higher sickness, leading Ross to seek authority for Cherokee-led detachments and autumn departures. Ferry tolls and closed bridges force delays that lengthen exposure in cold months. Each constraint multiplies the next. Arrests drive families into stockades. Stockades concentrate disease. Delays at rivers soak blankets and ruin flour. By late summer 1838, the causes and administrative choices have converged into a transport schedule that will determine survival by three variables: only water shelter and pace. October 1837 to May 1838. Cherokee Nation East. District headmen bring news from agency offices to farmsteads along the Hiwassee and Etowah. Couriers ride between New Echota and Fort Cass, Tennessee, with copies of circulars that clarify nothing and fix everything. The May 1838 deadline stands. Disarmament will be enforced. Voluntary parties will receive rations if they depart promptly. Georgia Guard patrols increase arrests for licensing violations and trespass on lands newly surveyed for lotteries. Mission schools in Hickory Log and Hawaii's report falling attendance as families move valuables to kin across district lines. The weather breaks early that spring and the roads harden, removing one of the last informal obstacles to roundup. May 17th to June 6, 1838. Fort Cass, Tennessee, and stockades across North Georgia. Major General Winfield Scott's printed address circulates with interpreters who stand on wagon boxes inside temporary enclosures at Fort Buffington near Canton. Son at Ross Landing on the Tennessee and at Gunter's Landing on the Coosa. The address promises humane treatment and insists on immediate compliance. Company officers record household headcounts in small field books. A clerk tallies tools, livestock, and improvements for later valuation. The Army's first communications bottleneck appears at once. Couriers ride out with seizure orders faster than wagons, and forage can be procured. Some enclosures receive bacon flour and salt daily. Others skip days and then receive double issues that spoil in the heat. A thunderstorm on the last week of May turns stockade floors to mud. Measles and whooping cough move through the densest pens. Mothers line cookfires with kettles borrowed from neighbors who were seized that morning without time to pack. Early June 1838. Ross Landing, Tennessee. A first water party is assembled under Army supervision for movement down the Tennessee River. The plan is to beat the worst heat and reduce marching by using boats to the Mississippi and then north of the Arkansas. A quartermaster requisitions flatboats and contracts a small steamer as a tug. Translators walk the line with lists of family names and call children to the correct craft. The column waits 2 days for a courier from Knoxville with invoices that release extra rations. In the pause, a measles box is carried aboard because the shade seems safer than the stockade. On the first evening downstream, the tug's boiler fails and the flotilla drifts to a sandbar until daybreak. A storm scatters the boats and 2 are grounded on a bend near the mouth of the Elk River. The captain's decision to make shore prevents capsizing, but exposes families to rain all night without tents on a bank that will later be recorded as no shelter available. June to July 1838. Fort Payne, Alabama, Gunter's Landing, Alabama, and Ross Landing, Tennessee. Contractor shortages and disease reports from the water party push a policy pivot. Principal Chief John Ross petitions to organize Cherokee-led detachments overland with Army escorts. After delays measured in weeks and courier's authority is granted, schedules are reissued, wagons are re-rigged. Blacksmiths at Fort Cass work by lantern to shoe teams and replace linchpins. The weather turns hot. Dust rises on the military road north of Gunter's Landing and settles into coughs that carry fever. At Fort Payne, a detachment loses 4 oxen to heat on a single afternoon. The loss forces a shuffle that moves elderly riders into a wagon that had been carrying tools, slowing the day's pace to single digits of miles. A courier from Nashville brings notice that ferry tolls have increased at 2 river crossings. Detachment leaders reroute, adding 2 days and 1 more creek ford where a child is swept from a parent's grasp and found downstream by a dragline of teenagers walking hand to hand. August 1838, Hiwassee Agency, Tennessee. The stockades thin as Cherokee-led detachments replace most contractor moves. Interpreters become the system's hinges. Most speak English and Cherokee, some add bits of Creek or Chickasaw picked up in mission towns years earlier. They explain ration scales to mothers, negotiate with ferrymen over tolls, and carry the day's counts back to the escort officer. A misinterpretation at a crossroad near Mouse Creek sends 20 wagons down a spur that dead ends at a private bridge closed by a landowner. The detachment backtracks 5 miles and camps on poor water. A woman gives birth in a borrowed tent, and the wagon assigned to her family remains at the center of the corral next morning with a wheel off to reset the tire. The day's mileage falls below 8. September 1838, Fort Cass, Tennessee, to the Cumberland River line. The first autumn cold fronts pass, and the columns breathe easier. Pace improves to 12 or more miles on good stretches, then the mail arrives. A courier from Washington City brings a change in accounting rules for subsistence issues. The quartermaster now demands specific signatures per adult and per child, not per household. Lines at ration wagons double in length. An interpreter collapses at noon from fever. His absence produces confusion over names with multiple spellings. A family is missed at issue time and must share their flour ration from neighbors that night. The escort officer writes 2 extra lines in his return to justify the discrepancy paperwork that holds the detachment at the next depot until the commandant approves the correction by pencil note. October 1838, Nashville, Tennessee to the Ohio River. Rains return, churn the clay, and force teams to double up on grades west of the Cumberland. Ferries on the Cumberland and smaller tributaries set daylight-only crossings in fog. A detachment under a Cherokee conductor reaches the Ohio opposite Golconda, Illinois, and finds ice forming in the eddies by the bank. The ferrymaster posts a new rate by nail on a post and refuses to honor a previous agreement. The escort officer sends a courier upriver seeking a second ferry. The reply comes after dark with 2 words only: ice worse. Families camp 2 nights within sight of the opposite shore. Children's shoes give out. Men cut rawhide thongs to lash soles and improvise mitts from sacking. December 1838, Ohio. River crossing at Golconda, Illinois and Mississippi approach. Cold intensifies. Wagons creak in the morning as frost releases. Detachments that have made the crossing grind along the southern Illinois trace toward the Mississippi with rations low from delays. Merchants at small settlements sell corn at inflated prices. Detachment leaders buy anyway and cut daily issues to stretch the stock. Exposure and dysentery peak together. A missionary who has walked with one of the largest detachments writes at a camp near the river. Today the people were compelled to ford a small stream, the ice about their legs, the wind piercing and sharp. Some have no shoes. We tried to cheer them, but many are sick, and the little ones suffer most. Daniel S. Butrick Journal near Golconda, Illinois, December 1838. Neutral narration resumes. The journal line matches multiple escort returns that note children chiefly among the day's sick lists. Officers record deaths in margins for lack of proper space. 2 more ferries on the Mississippi slow the approach to Indian Territory as ice runs along the banks near Cape Girardeau and farther south at the mouth of the Ohio. The delay adds days when the calendar has no warmth to spare. January 1839, Springfield, Missouri line to the Arkansas River. Cold abates and miles improve. Wheelwrights who learned the common failures in September carry extra spokes and tires. Breakdowns drop. Yet the cumulative effect of earlier delays remains. Measles moves ahead of the detachments into settlements. The disease meets weakened children at campfires, where blankets are thin and flour has been stretched with coarse meal. A courier overtakes one detachment with an order to shift route to avoid a washed-out bridge. The detour adds a day and a ford. Another carries word that Fort Gibson has reopened a larger ration issue on arrival news that lifts morale across a bitter week. Each of these dated incidents, stockade seizures under May, orders failed summer water movement, and the pivot to Cherokee-led trains and winter river bottlenecks tightens the same vice. Communication is intermittent, interpreted across languages, and carried by horse and weather that ruins ink and soaks paper. Decisions taken to limit cost or hurry, schedules ripple outward as exposure and disease. The actors remain the same, but their tools narrow to 3 variables measured daily by escort officers and remembered forever by families' water, shelter, and pace. October 1835 to March 1836. New Echota and Washington City. A minority delegation signs the Treaty of New Echota. The United States Senate ratifies it by a close vote and fixes a 2-year window for voluntary emigration. The docket that makes removal lawful on paper is simple and linear treaty text transmitted to the Senate. Ratification entered in the journal. Appropriations in 1837 and 1838 to pay contractors, escorts, and rations. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, still under the War Department, issues circulars to agents to prepare rolls value improvements and identify depot sites. Georgia continues to extend state jurisdiction into Cherokee districts, selling surveyed parcels through lotteries and licensing ferries on rivers the Cherokees still inhabit. The legal path is now a schedule. May 1838, Fort Cass, Tennessee. Major General Winfield Scott receives his orders and publishes his printed address to the Cherokee. The order's tone is severe and paternal, at once promising strict protection, yet setting an ultimatum. The president has sent me with a powerful army, he tells assembled families through interpreters, to cause you in obedience to the Treaty of 1835 to join that part of your people who are already established in prosperity in the West. The same sheet forbids ill usage and authorizes families to carry property within practical limits. Headquarters instructions lay out the enforcement sequence: seize those who have not departed by the deadline, gather them at temporary stockades, move in escorted parties by water where feasible, shift to road columns as needed. Officers receive authority to impress wagons and to hire interpreters. Quartermasters receive ration scales by pounds of bacon and flour per person per day. The rulebook insists on order and humanity. The ground will test both. May to June 1838. North Georgia and the Tennessee Valley. Arrest orders arrive faster than transport does. Company officers fan out from Fort Cass to stockade points at Fort Buffington, Fort Payne, Ross Landing, Gunter's Landing, and smaller posts. Rules of arrest are plain. Households are to be gathered without delay or violence, but in practice the hours between a dawn knock and an evening pen fill with grief and haste. In districts where the Georgia Guard accompanies United States detachments, seizures are rougher. Where missionaries or long-serving agency interpreters are present, seizures are slower and sometimes allow families to collect kettles, blankets, and tools. The first contact with the transport system exposes its choke points. Not all posts have cattle on the hoof or flour in sacks. A thunderstorm turns pens to mud. Measles and whooping cough move through crowded enclosures. Scott issues a second reminder against harshness after receiving complaints, a signal that paper rules are already slipping at the edges. June 1838. Ross Landing, Tennessee. The policy plan attempts speed by river. Flatboats are lashed to a small hired steamer, families are counted aboard, and the flotilla pushes down the Tennessee toward the Mississippi. The boiler fails the first night, and the tow drifts onto a bar. A storm scatters boats. Sick children ride out rain on open decks because canvas is short. An officer's brief after-action line is clipped, and honest boats made shore to save lives. Exposure severe, sickness increased. The water experiment is not abandoned everywhere, but it loses its priority. June to August 1838. Fort Cass and agency posts. John Ross negotiates. The request is practical, not defiant. Allow Cherokee-led detachments delay mass departures until autumn set, escort roles that keep discipline but give Cherokee conductors control over pace and camp order. Weeks pass while couriers move between Knoxville and Washington City. Authority is granted. The system bends from contractor batches to Cherokee trains with Army oversight. Blacksmiths work at lantern light to shoe teams and repair wheels. Detachment registers list conductors, interpreters, and approximate head counts. The rule now is a hybrid federal escort and ration issue Cherokee daily management. September to November 1838. Northern Alabama to the Ohio line. The march is rendered in prose on the daybooks of conductors and escort lieutenants. Detachments leave Gunter's Landing and Ross Landing, move through Pulaski and Nashville, cross the Cumberland, and angle northwest toward the Ohio. Terrain and crossings dictate pace. Clay roads churn under early autumn rains. Teams double on grades. Ferries set daylight-only rules in fog. At Golconda, on the Ohio ice rims the bank before the first week of December, and ferry rates jump. A courier sent upriver returns after dark with the words, "Ice worse." Households camp 2 nights within sight of the opposite shore. The order of march rise, push halt for water, push corral issue breaks on the rocks of river capacity and weather. The rules of issue require adult-by-adult signatures. Interpreters juggle variant spellings and exhaustion. A new accounting circular slows lines and stretches tempers. The winter stress that planners hope to avoid by moving in summer now arrives because the summer water plan faltered and the autumn road plan met ferries and clay. Winter 1838 to early 1839, southern Illinois and Missouri to the Arkansas line. Exposure and disease peak together. Escort officers write children chiefly beside daily sick lists as measles and dysentery follow cold and wet camps. Detachment leaders buy corn at inflated prices in settlements along the trace and cut daily flour issues to make the sacks last. The humanitarian outcome depends on variables that look small on a map but large by firelight, whether a tent is dry, whether a mother has shoes, whether a wagon wheel holds after a ford. A missionary walking with one of the largest detachments writes of ice about the legs of people fording a small stream and of little ones who suffer most. The line reads like a dispatch from a military hospital, but the patients are families and the wound is the weather. The rules against ill usage still sit on a page in a trunk. The page is not a roof. Spring 1839, Indian Territory. The Arkansas and Verdigris crossings mark the end of the road for most detachments. Fort Gibson registers arrivals and issues extra rations. The legal phase that began as a Senate docket resolves into a census of survivors. Councils reconvene, courts are re-established, schools reopen. Political retaliation erupts in June, when prominent treaty signers are killed, a grim coda to the dispute over authority that began in 1835. The federal file closes with abstracts of accounts and a statistical conclusion. Approximately 16,000 people were removed. Deaths during roundup camp confinement and the journey fall in the low thousands, with many scholars converging on 3,000 to 4,000. The range reflects irregular record-keeping, duplicate names, and lost returns. The numbers are not folklore. They are estimates built from lists, journals, and agency letters. Where memoirs speak of bayonets driving people like cattle, there is no single verified order to that effect. There are, however, enough stockade seizures without warning and enough sworn complaints to demonstrate that enforcement varied sharply by post and officer. One famous line usually attributed to Andrew Jackson, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it," circulates widely in later retellings. Historians note it as, at best unverified, a folklore line that captures a policy stance but lacks a contemporary source. Across the seasons, the confrontation is administrative rather than martial, but its structure mirrors a campaign. Orders of battle become lists of depots, ferries, and escorts. Rules of engagement become arrest instructions and ration scales. Maneuver is the choice of route around a closed bridge or an iced ferry. Casualty is exposure and contagion, not shot and shell. 2 brief quotes frame the contrast between paper and ground. From the initial enforcement sheet, all who quietly submit shall be treated kindly, protected in their persons and property, and escorted to the west. From an escort officer's winter return on the Illinois Trace, rations short. Children chiefly on the sick list. Progress 6 miles, weather severe. The difference between the two is the story. Negotiation never stops, even while columns move. Ross continues to press for funds for better issue scales and for relief at the end of the road. Agents in Indian Territory argue over valuations of Eastern improvements and the timing of annuity payments. Churches reopen and print minutes that record both baptisms and petitions. By summer 1839, the legal path has completed its cycle treaty ratification, appropriation orders, enforcement arrival, and accounts closed. What remains are institutions rebuilt in a new geography and a ledger that historians keep reopening to reconcile names and numbers with weather and roads. The campaign has no battlefield monument. Its markers are ferry landings, creek fords, ridge graves, and the foundations of new council houses west of the Mississippi. October 1838, Fort Cass, Tennessee. The fulcrum appears not as a battle, but as a negotiated change of method. Principal Chief John Ross secures permission to replace most contractor-led removals with Cherokee-led detachments under Army escort. Objective: restore internal order over base camp routine and care for the vulnerable. Avoid the heat disease spiral seen in early summer. Constraints: thin stocks of tents and blankets, limited veterinary support for teams' ferries with daylight-only rules, and new ration accounting signatures that slow issue lines. Immediate effect: the initiative shifts modestly back to Cherokee conductors' camp. Hygiene improves, wheelwrights, standardized field repairs, and march discipline steadies. But the calendar becomes the counter-maneuver. Delays needed to organize detachments slide the main movement into cold rain and early ice. The pivot preserves order and trades fevers of summer for exposure of winter. September to December 1838. Gunter's Landing, Alabama to Golconda, Illinois. The road proves the constraint set. Detachments advance 12 to 15 miles on firm days, 6 to 8 when clay turns to paste. Choke points accumulate fords, ferries, ridge grades where teams must double. Rules of engagement are arrest orders and ration scales rather than volleys and charges. Names called at issue wagons, signatures collected per adult and child escorts, counting heads at dawn and dusk. Objectives diverge. Army officers aim to meet Washington City timetables and keep sick lists within tolerable ranges. Cherokee conductors try to protect children and elders, shorten wet camps, and avoid night crossings. Weather asserts a higher rule. At the Ohio ice rims the bank and ferrymen double tolls. 2 nights camped within sight of the far shore consume the remaining fat of the ration sacks. Exposure shows in the ledgers as children chiefly among the sick. Initiative briefly gained by better internal order slips to river capacity and the price of passage. January to March, 1839. Southern Illinois and Missouri to the Arkansas and Verdigris. The turning moment resolves when the worst cold breaks. Miles per day rise. Farriers who learned September's failures carry spare spokes, tires, and linchpins. Arrivals tick up at Fort Gibson. The objective now is not speed, but consolidation. Receive detachments, issue extra rations, and disperse families to surveyed tracks. Constraints persist: thin clothing, contagious disease still moving in camp circles, but the principal choke points are behind the columns. The initiative settles into rebuilding. Courts are re-established, schools reopen, presses roll. A political coda follows in June 1839 when prominent treaty signers are killed, proof that the legal wound from 1835 has not closed with the march's end. One admission against interest brief. Bureaucratic and damning survives and winter returns. Rations short and issues irregular. Progress 6 miles. Children chiefly on the sick list. Weather severe. Escort officer, daily return, Illinois trace. December 1838. The sentence concedes what policy could not admit in public. The logistics plan was failing precisely where its humanitarian assurances mattered most. The admission is not a denunciation. It is a line-item truth logged by the enforcing side. Objective and constraints at the pivot rendered plainly. Who, John Ross and Cherokee conductors on one side of the ledger. Major General Winfield Scott's escorts and quartermasters on the other, where Fort Cass and the Tennessee Valley depots outward along the military road to the Ohio and across southern Illinois and Missouri to Fort Gibson. When authority granted late summer 1838, main movement September through January, first consolidations March 1839. Objectives: restore Cherokee control of daily rhythm, meet federal timetables with acceptable mortality, land families west with tools enough to plant. Constraints: ferries that charge more when ice forms, bridges that fail under doubled teams, ration rules that require signatures per head while interpreters collapse with fever, wagons that turn to shelters at dusk and must still roll at dawn. Immediate effects map cleanly to initiative shifts. Cherokee-led detachments reduce disorder inside camps. Cut theft and improve field repairs, initiative gained. Ferries and early ice stall crossings and extend exposure, initiative lost. Arrival at Fort Gibson with extra rations and surveyed tracks stabilizes communities, initiative regained, but not the lives already lost. A brief evidence-based counterfactual clarifies the hinge. If early summer water transport had concentrated scarce canvas and medical oversight on a few properly towed craft, the system might have avoided some winter exposure. Yet, boiler failure, open decks, and river storms in June had already demonstrated that undercapitalized water movement traded miles for measles. Conversely, had Cherokee-led detachments been authorized 2 months earlier, with priority command of ferries and fixed tolls columns could have cleared the Ohio before ice. Yet such authority required state compliance that Georgia and local ferrymen were unlikely to grant. Both hypotheticals fail on the same fixed point, named in P2 policy assured movement without guaranteeing capacity at choke points owned by others. Human cost demands names and paths, not abstractions. Detachments under Cherokee conductors like John Benge and George Hicks carry family lists that descend the Hiwassee Pass at Ross Landing and Gunter's Landing, cross at Golconda, and angle southwest for the Mississippi, and then the Arkansas line. Sick lists name children and elders. Burial details mark ridge tops and creek banks chosen for dry soil. Mission journals and escort returns agree that children chiefly are lost in December. Women deliver infants in tents or wagons. A child swept at a ford is found by a hand-to-hand drag of teenagers downstream. The winter count motif, one image to carry a year's meaning, would be ice at the ferry and a ration line stalled by a signature rule while daylight fades. The pivot also set the stage for the political reckoning that followed. June 1839 in Indian Territory. The killings of Major John Ridge and Elias Boudinot turned treaty politics into blood. Those names and the path that carried them west tie the logistical hinge of autumn 1838 to the institutional fracture of summer 1839. Families who rebuilt courts and schools did so beside graves dug on the road, and under a constitution revised to contain the treaty wound. Synthesis back to P2 shows the structural forces holding the lever. The Indian Removal Act supplied money and discretion. The Georgia Compact and state laws erased tribal jurisdiction on the ground. The unenforced Worcester decision left a principal without a sheriff. The Treaty of New Echota provided the instrument and deadline. Railroad charters and land lotteries set the appetite. Agency rules on rations and signatures shaped daily life. When Ross won Cherokee-led control of the column, he moved within that frame, not outside it. Logistics could improve camp order. It could not melt river ice or nullify tolls. The turning point therefore sits exactly where policy met physics, a humane intent declared on paper, a calendar advanced by negotiation, and a winter that converted choke points into casualties. By spring 1839, the column's momentum bled off at Fort Gibson, but the force vectors from P2 law, land pressure, administrative design continued past the river. They explain why the march happened, why the pivot came late, and why the numbers at the end are a range rather than a ledger balanced to the person. The decisive act was not a clash, but a choice of method under constraint, and the cost is written where weather ferries and rules of issue cross names on a page. April 1839, Fort Gibson, Indian Territory. The escort ledgers close, and a different set of books opens courts, annuities, land rolls, school registers. The Cherokee Nation, Anaewia, adopts a new constitution at Tahlequah later that year, restoring executive, legislative, and judicial branches in the West, and anchoring jurisdiction after the march. Law and administration proceed on parallel tracks. Claims for Eastern improvements move through federal offices. Annuities due under the Treaty of New Echota are calculated, contested, and intermittently paid. Agency ration issues taper as families plant along the Arkansas and verdigris. Records from Fort Gibson's quartermaster in spring 1839 show increased issues on arrival, a short bridge between survival on the road and subsistence on new fields. The legal scaffolding that defined Indian Removal Act 1830 and Worcester v. Georgia 1832 now reappears as footnotes in petitions, while the Cherokee Constitution of 1839 supplies the day-to-day authority to convene courts, survey districts, and license ferries. Land and resources define the next decade. The council reopens ferries and roads under national control and licenses traders whose paperwork now carries Tahlequah seals. Timber leases and mill permits appear in council minutes. Bottomlands are parceled to households under national law long before any federal allotment program intrudes. Railroads approach from the north and east, survey lines for the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas, and the St. Louis and San Francisco push toward Indian Territory, and pressure grows to regularize right-of-way and station grounds. The Cherokee Outlet, stretching west toward the plains, becomes the nation's principal commercial lever. Cattle companies lease passage at per-head rates in the 1880s, a revenue stream documented in council proceedings and later litigated when federal pressure forces the sale and the 1893 opening of the outlet to settlers. Those lease books and the presidential proclamations that followed are the administrative shadow of a larger reality that began in 1839. Jurisdiction had to be defended on paper every year, or it would be narrowed by survey, railroad, or statute. Demography and health recover slowly from the winter of 1838-1839. Population studies that collate agency lists and later censuses see Russell Thornton's reconstructions show declines during removal, then a gradual rebound as birth rates outpace mortality in the 1840s and 1850s. Missionary physicians and council appropriations note outbreaks of measles and smallpox in the early 1840s. A regional cholera wave later in the decade is recorded in mission journals and agency hospital returns with terse lines about camp sanitation and river water. Parish registers and school rolls reveal another axis of continuance: baptisms resume, attendance climbs, the ratio of children to elders and family groups stabilizes. The lived effect is visible in payrolls for blacksmiths and wheelwrights, more tools, fewer funeral corvées. Education becomes the emblem of Reconstruction. The Cherokee National Council establishes the female and male seminaries by acts in the mid-1840s. The first students enter the female seminary in 1851 under a curriculum that would not embarrass an Eastern academy. Receipts for bricks, teachers' contracts, and examination reports survive in national archives and in the printed laws of the Cherokee Nation. Sequoia's syllabary remains in use alongside English. The Cherokee Advocate resumes publication, binding law news and memory into a weekly rhythm. These school records, together with court dockets and revenue ledgers, are the positive counterweight to the removal columns. They show capacity restored and then improved. Law turns again during the American Civil War. The nation divides, some leaders siding with the Union, others with the Confederacy. The aftermath is formalized in the Treaty of 1806 between the Cherokee Nation and the United States. That document, read alongside wartime claims files, abolishes slavery. In the nation, affirms citizenship for freedmen and their descendants, and confirms jurisdiction with painful concessions. It also restarts annuity calculations and land questions that had paused during the war. The 1866 treaty is a hinge as consequential for governance as the 1835 treaty was for geography. It appears on nearly every later legal brief about citizenship and boundary. The long fight over communal land culminates not with a single vote, but with a sequence of federal statutes and agreements. The Dawes Act of 1887 establishes allotment policy nationwide. The Curtis Act of 1898 extends federal judicial power in Indian Territory and weakens tribal courts. The Cherokee Allotment Agreement, finalized in the opening years of the 20th century, breaks communal land into individual allotments while setting aside town sites and public institutions. Survey plats, allotment certificates, and contest dockets form a mountain of paper proof that removal did not end the legal campaign, but changed its venue. In the same files, railroad right-of-way deeds and depot plans show steel lines stitched across the nation, bringing markets and new leverage for outside interests. The legal record here is abundant congressional statutes, presidential proclamations on the Cherokee Outlet, and the printed laws of the Cherokee Nation that attempted to control damage while preserving institutions. Cultural continuance runs through and around these files. Ceremonial cycles adapt to the new geography. Stomp grounds are reestablished. Seasonal movements for planting and harvest are retimed to rivers west of the Mississippi. Language use shifts under pressure from mission schools and then public schools. Yet, syllabary primers and later immersion curricula prove resilience. Ledger drawings are more closely associated with Plains nations, but Cherokee memory fixes on other media printed anniversaries in the Cherokee Advocate. Church minutes that mark All Souls services for relatives buried along the Tennessee and Ohio, and later in the 20th century, historic trail commemorations and community rides that retrace the detachments. One of the most visible, the Remember the Removal bike ride organized by Cherokee citizens, follows segments of the route each year and uses escort journals and detachment maps as waypoints. The program's itinerary and participants' journals show how a transport schedule became a civic act of remembrance. Memory also lives in place. The Trail of Tears National Historic Trail marks water lines and road traces across Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. National Park Service route studies county deed books that identify ferry landings and state historical markers, knit together a map that did not exist on a wall in 1838, but which families carried in their heads and feet. Church cemeteries west of the Arkansas hold names that match escort lists from Fort Cass. Some families keep the names of children lost in December 1838 as middle names 3 generations later. When community leaders speak at annual observances in Tahlequah, each Labor Day commemorating adoption of the 1839 Constitution, they are addressing a civic holiday rooted in law that grew out of grief. Present-day governance closes the circle with law. The Cherokee Nation, headquartered at Tahlequah in Oklahoma, operates courts, a marshal service, clinics, and hospitals and language programs. Its reservation boundaries in eastern Oklahoma have been affirmed in modern federal decisions that built on the principle in Worcester of Georgia and the treaty record afterward. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, headquartered at Cherokee in North Carolina, maintains self-government on the Qualla boundary. The United Kituwa Band also maintains programs in Oklahoma. Contemporary language revitalization immersion schools, master-apprentice programs. The Durban Feeling Language Center publishes textbooks and signage in syllabary and ASCII transliteration. Program charters, court decisions, and annual reports from all three federally recognized Cherokee governments are today's equivalent of the 19th century ledgers they show policy converted to services, not marches. 5 to 8 records cited in prose frame this aftermath. Worcester v. Georgia, 31 U.S. 515, 1832 remains the baseline sovereignty principle. The Treaty of New Echota, 1835, and the Senate Journal entries for its 1836 ratification explain the removal instrument. Fort Gibson arrival returns in spring 1839, and escort daybooks supply the transition to settlement. The 1839 Cherokee Constitution at Tahlequah and the printed laws authorize courts and schools. The Treaty of 1806 between the Cherokee Nation and the United States reconstructs jurisdiction and citizenship after the Civil War. The Dawes Act, 1887, the Curtis Act, 1898, and the Cherokee Allotment Agreement with its survey plats explain the end of communal tenure. Presidential proclamations and council lease books record the Cherokee outlet story in the 1880s and 1893. National Park Service route studies for the Trail of Tears and the modern court decisions that affirm reservation boundaries in eastern Oklahoma carry the legal thread into the present. What began as a removal ledger, dates, ferries, ration scales, becomes a civic ledger, statutes, school enrollments, clinic visits, language certificates. The structural forces named earlier federal policy discretion, state land appetite, and administrative design did not vanish after 1839. They were rechanneled into courts, contracts, and classrooms. The continuance is visible in something as prosaic as a budget line for textbooks and as solemn as a stone at a winter grave. Scholarly consensus holds 3 principal conclusions. First, removal was a policy choice executed through treaty appropriations and orders, not an inevitable collision of cultures. The decisive instruments were the Indian Removal Act, 1830, the Treaty of New Echota, 1835, and the refusal to enforce Worcester of Georgia, 1832. Second, the human toll arose less from combat than from logistics under constraint, stockade disease, river bottlenecks, winter exposure, and ration shortfalls, producing deaths commonly estimated in the low thousands. Third, the Cherokee Nation reconstituted durable institutions in the West, including courts, schools, and a press, and those institutions carried sovereignty arguments forward into later treaties, allotment litigation, and modern jurisdiction cases. Key points remain contested. Mortality ranges vary by method and dataset. Many historians converge on 3,000 to 4,000 deaths, while others argue lower or higher, depending on how incomplete roles and duplicate names are treated. The role of individual actors is debated. Some accounts stress presidential policy continuity from Andrew Jackson to Martin Van Buren. Others emphasize the autonomous pressure applied by Georgia law and land lotteries. The legitimacy and consequences of the Treaty of New Echota are also argued. One view holds it as an unauthorized cession imposed by an unrepresentative minority. Another contends it reflected a grim calculation to limit losses within a policy environment that was already fixed. Language for the event's legal characterization diverges as well. Some scholars apply genocide or ethnic cleansing frameworks. Others resist prisonist labels and hold to the period's treaty and statute vocabulary while still documenting coercion and attrition. The enduring legacy operates on 3 planes. In doctrine, Worcester v. Georgia becomes a long arc precedent for tribal sovereignty even though it was unenforced at the time. Later decisions and statutes echo its principle that nations retain inherent authority unless clearly diminished by Congress. In reform, the Trail of Tears reshapes debates over federal trust duty, annuity management, and the design of removal and reservation systems, later surfacing in the critique of allotment and in 20th century policy shifts. In symbol, the route stands as a civic ledger of ferries, depots, and graves that communities mark with ceremonies, school curricula, and historic trail sites. It frames public memory for other removals and situates Cherokee continuance not as a footnote, but as an institutional achievement. Assessment across archives and timelines therefore returns to the same hinge. Law without enforcement opened a path for state intrusion. A contested treaty supplied the instrument. Logistics under seasonal stress converted policy into loss. Institutional reconstruction converted survival into jurisdiction and culture. The event endures in memory because it binds law logistics and lives into a single root, whose lessons still govern how sovereignty is argued and how a nation insists on its continuance. Today we saw a journey where law logistics and lives intersect a route written in dates, ferries, and unmarked graves. Big picture policy set the frame, weather and roads set the price. The community rebuilt institutions from ash. What was the real breaking point? How should casualties be estimated, and from which sources? Thanks for watching.